Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the Editor-in-Chief of Abrams ComicArts, the comics and graphic novel-oriented imprint turned division of Abrams Books. It's Charles Kochman. Thanks for coming on, Charles.
Thank you for having me.
So we're recording this on Thursday, April 27th, so if anything happens after this, that's why we didn't talk about it. But I just have to ask, how's your day starting?
So far, so good. This is my second meeting of the day, second of, I guess, 5. So ask me in a couple of hours, I'll have a different answer.
I don't know if the Zoom and Teams era has made meetings more frequent, but sometimes it feels like it. Maybe it's because you have to go on a specific thing to execute them, but it sometimes feels like they're more abundant these days.
Yeah, because I don't think we had meetings. We had conversations, they were different. You would see people in the hallway, talk about them. You have a conversation about whatever. Now you have to, if you're not in the office, you have to organize a time to have that conversation. So that becomes a meeting. We're in the office 2 days a week, soon to be 3 days a week. And I think that's going to be a good thing because being in person, being able to casually stop by somebody's desk, talk about something instead of scheduling a meeting or writing a long email or whatever, that's always a good thing.
Well, and also those spontaneous things where you're like, is this really a Zoom meeting? Is this really a Teams meeting? You can have that conversation and maybe build on that immediately.
Right.
That is nice. But I mean, I imagine you have to have a lot of those just because it seems like you have a lot of hats. I mean, you're the EIC of Abrams ComicArts, but also you're the person who edits Jeff Kinney's massive selling Diary of a Wimpy Kid series, which is seemingly always on the verge of another release. I didn't realize that they pretty much release every October or November, and they have for like the past 12 years or so in terms of the regular frequency. All of that is to say nothing of other things you assuredly take on. But, I'm genuinely curious, like, what's a day in your life like? Is it impossible to say that there's a consistent view of it just because you do have so many hats?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that, every week we're the same or every day, sort of like, oh, I'm at my desk at this time and whatever. It's not as structured as that because it's really dependent largely on the meetings that are scheduled or working from home versus being in the office. But, by and large, we publish a Wimpy Kid book every year since 2007, with the exception of last year, we published 2 Wimpy Kid books a year during the pandemic and right after this sort of sub-series, Raleigh Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Adventures. So yeah, for a while there was 2 Wimpy Kid books on top of ComicArts. And then I still do on the Amulet list, which is our kids list, the occasional graphic novel or graphic novel series for kids. We just announced the Marvel Super Stories anthology. So we're just wrapping up book 1, getting ready to start on book 2. Before that, I was doing this middle grade series with John Cheska called Frank Einstein, and then a Garbage Pail Kids series with R.L. Stein. So it's sort of different parts of my brain. I was an English major with a focus on children's books, and I was a comics fan. So that's sort of what coming to Abrams allowed me to sort of, all those things to merge together.
Well, I guess, Abrams ComicArts, one thing that you don't really do is it's not really oriented on children's stuff. So having the Amulet stuff is a nice way to kind of work off of your background and kind of build on things that you might already be interested in, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I first came to Abrams, which was in 2005, we weren't doing graphic novels for kids. Then slowly we started doing, a handful of books, which I didn't edit, but they were buy-ins. We did these manga Shakespeare titles. And then I started bringing in other titles, working with Kazu Kibuishi on his Explorer series. We had Frank Camuso doing Salem Hyde, and we had Eddie Pittman doing Red's Planet and, Suey in the Shadow. So we had a handful of things, and that has now become a program. And that's part of, where you referenced ComicArts being a division, where that comes into play is that for years we had 2 businesses at Abrams. We had the adult business and the kids business. And now comics is its own third business for the company. So I'll be focusing on the adult stuff with the occasional kids title. And then we have a whole team of editors, Charlotte Greenbaum and Maggie Lerman, who will be focusing on the Amulet stuff. Like I said, I'll occasionally do still do a kids graphic novel. They'll occasionally contribute to the ComicArts list. The nice thing about Abrams is we're a small company and we can cross, sort of not catalog, but cross departmental editorial responsibilities, which is really how Wimpy Kid came about. At the time, I was in the adult group. It wasn't right for the adult group. So when I went to at the time, the kids editor, which was a man named Howard Reeves, with the proposal, he liked it, thankfully, and he greenlit it. And then I got to edit that. But I was in the adult group working men on the kids group, which was a little unusual for most companies, but at Abrams it's been a really natural kind of thing, and we've had lots of editors work on different lists.
I do think it's interesting though, because normally once you get to a certain level, like once you're doing something like, you started editing Wimpy Kid before Abrams ComicArts existed. And then it's steadily grown. Now it's a division. Now it's this big thing. I imagine in a lot of places that would be something you'd have to give up. But I mean, is part of the reason why you keep Wimpy Kid in your purview, is that because you just have that established relationship with Jeff, and like it's something that you've been doing for so long, so it's kind of unimaginable to not have that as part of your repertoire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's rare for an editor to work with the same author as many years as Jeff and I have. Most writers, if you look at like Stephen King, has probably had 3 or 4 editors over his career or whatever. Jeff and I are just very much in sync. We get along from the day we met. We had a nice connection, and I think it works. And as long as Jeff is happy, which is really ultimately the only thing that matters, I'll continue to work on Wimpy Kid, because one, it's really obviously important to the company and to all our foreign publishers, all over the world. So, that's the biggest priority I have. And when Wimpy Kid sort of lands, that sort of takes over for a little bit. But we have it down. We're working on the 18th book as we speak, and he's finishing up the first draft, which will, come to me shortly. But we have it down pretty tightly, and there's no point in sort of changing courses in midstream, unless there was a reason that Jeff wanted. Again, that's really going to be the determining factor. But as long as we keep getting along and we're able to work well together, which we do, I feel like I don't want to give up Wimpy Kid also, because one, being so successful as a series, what it allows me to do is sort of leverage that success to do other things that the company probably wouldn't have done otherwise, like comics in the very beginning. I think it's safe to say that when we launched ComicArts in 2009, it was a direct offshoot of the fact that I'd been working with Jeff, and I think I had also been editing some graphic novel titles, and that was a management call to sort of keep me happy and keep me involved in what I wanted to do while working on Wimpy Kid, which was so important to the company.
Also, you mentioned how maybe it's an important book, but I came across this quote from you long ago where you said, I think the success of that series is perhaps the single most important thing I've accomplished in my career. So it's clearly something that's important to you as well. I don't know if that's still true, but at the same time, it's not very often editors can point to one thing and say that this is the most meaningful thing I've done.
Yeah, it would, we've sold 275 million copies all over the world.
That's a fair few.
Yeah. So it's hard to ignore that achievement and that accomplishment and to be a part of that. And, I think that, before that I was working at DC Comics for 12 years. And before that at Bantam Books, I worked on Choose Your Own Adventure. I worked on, Superman and Batman magazine, which sold 1 million copies an issue. I've worked on things that sold a lot, but Wimpy Kid is sort of, somebody once wrote in a story that it was about seeing the lights on the Empire State Building, and one of the windows was flickering and then went out. And they said, imagine having a job where even the man casually walking down the street could tell that you didn't do your job properly. And I feel like, Wimpy Kid is like that light bulb in the Empire State Building. Everybody all over the world is waiting for this book. We have 67 foreign publishers that publish at the same time that we do. So it's a huge coordinated effort between our team, our sales team, our rights team, our marketing publicity teams. Our managing editor, who without her, I don't know that we could do what we do, and production as well. So like everybody's sort of working, to make this happen, but you only do that. You can't do that for every book. It's just, not sustainable. But when you're selling that many copies of a book and it's being read all over the world to that number, you put the resources that you need to it. So Wimpy Kid will always be the priority. And I would say that, in answer to the quote that you quoted, every book I work on with Jeff, and we laugh about this, but I always feel that it's the best book he's done. Mm-hmm. I honestly believe he keeps pushing himself to do better and better and learn more and more about how to tell a better story. The Jeff who did the first 3 books is not the same Jeff who's writing these books. He's learned way more about his craft, and it's fun to sort of be along for the ride with that, because in the beginning he was getting feedback from me on story structure and how to take what he had online, which was 1,300 pages, and make it into the first 3 books. And then after that, he way eclipsed me in terms of his knowledge of story structure or basic, plotting, whatever. So, it's been mutually beneficial. I've learned, like I said, I've learned a lot from him as well.
I do think it's funny, you mentioned about how like there's all these eyes and so like kids will like notice these things. I remember there's a cartoonist named Gail Galligan who told me that kids are smart, like kids notice these things. Like there was a book that Gail did where I think it was like they had depicted the sun as rising on the wrong coast or like the wrong direction. And a letter came in from this kid being like, well, that's not how that would work. And I mean, it's just like you wouldn't expect that sort of thing, but kids notice everything. Kids are a lot smarter than you give them credit for necessarily. But I do want to say, too, you mentioned that analogy about how like, you notice when the lights are on and like they're not supposed to be and everything. Like that's something that people will notice. I imagine people would notice if you edited a choose your own adventure book incorrectly too, because it's like when those go wrong, and I've never read one of those, so shouts to all the choose your own adventure books editors. I imagine you're immediately like, what is happening here? This page told me to go to page 142. This isn't continuing this. What's going on? That must be a weird thing to edit.
They were really hard. I wasn't the first editor at Choose. I think I was the fourth, but I had the longest tenure on Choose. I went from book 84 to 160. So that was a lot. Plus I was doing, sub-series, with different sort of authors within the Choose Your Own Adventure sort of umbrella. So it was a lot of books, but they were once a month, so I learned about point of view. I learned about plotting. Sometimes you had to rewrite stories. So I learned to be a writer with Choose Your Own Adventure. They were amazing, but we also had an amazing, again, infrastructure. I had a great editor I worked with, Carla Jablonski, who went over everything that I did, and I went over everything she did, and we had these book maps, so you could tell like everything was really intensely plotted. But the one thing that people noticed, I'll tell you, and it sort of made me a stickler in my career for this, is we had all the spines, like you were talking before we started recording about the manga titles on your bookshelf in the back that, everything lines up. We had one title that didn't match up. And we would get letters at Bantam Books all the time from people saying like, book number, I think it was, like 70 something, didn't match or whatever, are you going to fix that? And we reprinted it. And then we sent replacement copies to people who wrote in to complain, because for kids, it's like they want their books to line up, and not just kids, adults too. I remember, giving a Wimpy Kid book to one of my friends, kids. And, literally the minute I walked in at Christmas with the book, and the minute I handed her the book, she grabbed my arm, we went to the room, she put it on the shelf next to them. We sat on the bed so she could look at them all lined up. And then she went and got it and started to read. But the first thing she wanted to do is see it lined against all the other ones.
Yeah. Comic fans are big on that too. Anytime there's a series that doesn't align, it's going to show up on the comic books Reddit, and people are going to be like, why did this happen?
Exactly.
It's a real thing. But I just want to go into a few questions about the, early days and kind of like the buildup of Abrams ComicArts. The thing I think people don't really realize sometimes when you talk about things during this period is Abrams ComicArts started in 2009. It launched as an imprint of Abrams. And you were coming off of the success of Diary of a Wimpy Kid and some other graphic novels you were editing, but it was an odd time in comics. Like the direct market was kind of middling. It was like right before the new 52 for DC and everything, and before like things really picked up for a bit. The book market wasn't nearly as developed as it is now. I mean, it was like 3 years after Scholastic Graphics and first popped up. So it's a completely different environment. What were the expectations for Abrams ComicArts at that point? And like, did you have specific goals for it from a creative standpoint?
Yeah. So let's see, to back a little bit, when I was at DC for 12 years, DC Comics, and I came to Abrams because I wanted to sort of exercise different muscles. I wanted to edit different kinds of books. I felt like I had done everything I could with DC and Mad Magazine that in terms of creating books that I could. So when I first came to Abrams, it was, I inherited a bunch of great books from our then editor-in-chief, Eric, who hired me. I did a book on the jazz photography. I did a book on golf courses, which I don't golf, but, it was nice to do something like that. That was visually different. I did a book on the dioramas at the Museum of Natural History. So I was doing books like that. But I had been there for, I would say, about 6 months, and I hadn't acquired anything. And my boss walked in and he said, you got to figure out what you want to do here. Do you want to be an acquiring editor, or do you want to just inherit books? Both were fine. as far as he was concerned. But I was looking for the right book, and I remember my uncle, who worked at the Strand bookstore, said that whatever your first acquisition is, that's how you're going to be known in the industry. So choose wisely. At that moment, after Eric left, my managing editor walked in with a couple of books in the slush pile that we were just, going to look at really quickly and then turn down. So we, went through them all. We were going to turn everything down. And then she had one called Mom's Cancer. And she said, oh, and here's this one, we would never publish a book called Mom's Cancer. And it's a graphic novel. It's a comic book too, I think she said. And I said, oh, let me see that. And I love the title, those two words together juxtaposed were, made me stop. And I read it and fell in love with it. And that was my first book. And I didn't know that I was looking for a graphic novel. I had no intention of coming to Abrams to do comics and graphic novels. Then I started, acquiring other books. I developed a program with the Topps Company. I did Wacky Packages and Garbage Pail Kids. And, both of those I worked with Art Spiegelman on, who I knew from my DC days. Kyle Baker's Nat Turner. I knew Kyle from my DC days. And, he was ready to do a collected edition of Nat Turner. He had done a, small, paperback version. So what happened was I was acquiring these books. I did, the first big art book I did was with Mark Evanier. It was Kirby, King of Comics. And here's a good point to how the times have changed. I brought that to our publications board meeting, and I was told by someone, let me get this straight. You want to do an art book about an artist at an art book company that nobody in this room has heard of but you. I don't know why I didn't get fired, but I said, well, that's the fault of the room, not the man. Everybody knows who Jack Kirby is. And thankfully, they let me do the book, and it did really, really well. And I think that was a big signal to the company, too, that there was this other kind of art and these other kinds of books that we could be doing. And that was sort of slowly brewing right before I got there. Eric and this woman, Deb Aronson, who were predecessors of mine, signed up two books that I did inherit. One was Cartoon America about the comics in the Library of Congress, and another one was a book by Dan Nadell called Art at a Time. So they had been making these motions toward that. As I think I mentioned before, we started recording about the Smith. Abrams published the Smithsonian Book of Newspaper Comics. We had a little bit of a history of comics, but it wasn't anything concerted. But what was happening was, while I was working on Wimpy Kid, while I was editing, the Garbage Pail Kids book or the Kirby book or the Nat Turner book, we had these books on the list, and it just sort of made sense that rather than have like one book per season or two books per season that would be littered throughout the adult list, let's put them all together and create an imprint. So that's where it came from. It wasn't something that I thought of or dreamed, and it wasn't my idea to create the imprint. That was management looking and saying, like, how do we take these titles that are doing well and give them a focused identity?
That makes sense. It is kind of interesting, though, looking at the Abrams ComicArts line even today. You publish graphic novels, both fiction and nonfiction, but you also publish sort of, you've already mentioned things like this, but like comics adjacent releases. Like recently there was the Uncanny X-Men by Jim Lee trading cards release, or like the visual history of the Marvel Value Stamps book that Roy Thomas did. There's a lot of variety in those releases. They are all about comics or are comics, but I'm interested in like, what is Abrams ComicArts' like overall purview? Like, do you have the ability to define what an Abrams ComicArts release is at your leisure, or does it always have to have like one foot in the comics realm?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when we created the imprint in 2009, I sort of broke everything down into three categories, which was the art book monographs, original graphic novels, and collections. So the collections would be the Topps books like Wacky Packages or the Jim Lee X-Men trading card book. We're collecting previously published material. And then there's the art books. So I define the triumvirate of Jack Kirby, Harvey Kurtzman, and Will Eisner. Those were the three that I felt were the most important sort of creators who needed a monograph. And especially at Abrams, I wanted, in looking at our shelves and all the art, Abrams was the first to publish the work of Norman Rockwell, and we were the first to publish the photographs of Richard Avedon. I wanted to make no distinction of the kinds of artists that could sit on our shelf side by side with those artists. In talking with people like Art Spiegelman and Jules Pfeiffer and Paul Levitz at DC, I came up with that triumvirate, for, Kirby for superhero comics, Eisner for the personal graphic novel, and Kurtzman for his impact, not just on Mad Magazine, which was profound, but also the war comics, which sort of were another kind of personal expression of graphic novel literature. So I define those three, and then we supplemented those obviously in the years since with books on Patrick McDonnell and Jaime Hernandez and Rube Goldberg and Charles Schultz. So we expanded that beyond. But I think that for me, what I've always tried to emphasize on the books that I sign up on the list is that first and foremost, we're an art book house. We're an art book publisher. So to me, the art is very important. So the artists that I work with, the artists that we publish or that we're developing are all people who have a style or who really, I feel like, there's a different, there are lots of conversations in circles that I'm in about, so-and-so is not a good artist, but now the bar is lower. I don't think the bar is lower. I think that's sort of like, our parents, talking about rock and roll music when we were kids, I think it's like things evolve and change. And I think that the level of what passed for quote acceptable or mainstream comics has evolved, and that's a good thing. So if you take the work of somebody like Liana Fink, who I think is a genius in terms of her cartooning, it's as much about the writing as it is about the illustrations, and to have your own style, a distinct style, is really important. Roz Chast faced that when she came to the New Yorker. People looked at it and said, like, she was bringing the magazine down because, one, she was female, and that was a little with a few exceptions, Victoria Roberts being one of them. There weren't many female cartoonists on the New Yorker, but her style was very idiosyncratic, and people thought she couldn't draw. She could draw very well. She just chooses to draw in that style because that reflects the sensibility that she's trying to communicate. So I think that my sort of tolerance or definition of what is art has evolved a lot, and that's thanks to other editors that work at Abrams, like Charlotte and Lydia, colleagues that I work with, who have brought other people to the table that I wouldn't have normally have encountered.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Bad Idea is back, and they're bringing their biggest book yet, Megalith. Megalith is an epic of unparalleled detail and artistry. It's the result of a mammoth 5-year production journey where no expense was spared, and a monument such as this demands an equally worthy presentation, and Bad Idea needs your help to make that a reality. In 2018, Matt Kint and Louis LaRosa set to create a comic book without the constraints of time and with an unrivaled budget. Joined by electric colorist Laura Martin and veteran letterer Taylor Esposito, what resulted from their efforts is an event comic unlike any before it. The comic book only known by its code name, Megalith. A comic book of such breathtaking beauty that it needs to be seen to be believed. This magnum opus of bad ideas hitting Kickstarter soon, with this crowdfunding effort focused on promoting the release into comic shops. So if you're a comic shop and you want Megalith in your stores, keep an eye on Kickstarter for just that. And now, back to the show. I do think it's interesting to look at the first 3 MarvelArts. And for listeners that don't know, MarvelArts is a collaboration between Marvel and Abrams ComicArts, where you publish things like Fantastic Four, Full Circle, amongst other things. But the first 3, if I remember correctly, are Fantastic Four, Full Circle from Alex Ross. And then you also have the Patrick McDonnell, the superhero's journey, the creator of Mutts, basically like having this metatextual journey through his own Marvel story told through characters of Marvel and possibly even featuring creators of Marvel. And then the third one is the artist on it is Michael Cho, who I think is on the short list of like the greatest artists going today. And it's interesting because Alex Ross, very like painterly style, but doing it in like in this way, he's like basically giving into every artistic whim he has in that book, and it looks incredible. And then Patrick McDonnell, way different stylistically. And then you have Michael Cho, who's very classic comic art. Like, he's got a vibe to him that evokes a different era. And it's interesting because those 3 you wouldn't think would necessarily fit typically in the same kind of line. But it seems to me that in terms of the art, you and your team kind of lean into, it's less about having a style and more about the right fit and just does it work?
Thank you for the kind words on MarvelArts. I'm really excited about that line of books because, as you can imagine, getting Marvel to recognize that there was another way to publish comics that was in addition to what they did.
Right.
Letting another party, Abrams, publish their characters in original graphic novels as opposed to reprinting stuff is a big deal. And I'm very grateful to them. And I work directly with, a team there. So none of what we do on the MarvelArts stuff is done, in isolation. Tom Brevoort, C.B. Cebulski, Sven Larson, we talk regularly. We go over every proposal. Everybody weighs in. When, we have a couple other characters that are in the works, which I can't talk about yet, unfortunately, but we work with the editors of those characters so that they're brought in. And it's been really collaborative. And I think MarvelArts started from conversations that Alex Ross and I had. Alex and I go back to my first month at DC Comics in January 1993. He did the cover for a Louise Simonson novelization of The Death of Superman.
Superman Doomsday and Beyond?
Yes, you did a deep dive. Thank you. So that was Alex's first published DC work. It came out, 7 months before Marvel's even came out. So he wasn't who he was, but, I saw his samples and fell in love with him. I called him up, and that was his first project. I was in what we call licensed publishing at the time. So it was books that we licensed to other publishers. We packaged, and then other publishers published it. So when he pitched me Kingdom Come after Marvel's, it wasn't something I could work on because at the time, again, I was licensing out instead of, editing books that were published by DC Comics. And after Kingdom Come, we had this idea to do these tabloids. So we did Superman Peace on Earth, Batman War on Crime, Wonder Woman Spirit of Truth, Shazam Power of Hope. We did all those yearly tabloids for, I think, 7 years, 6 or 7 years, something like that. And, that was really successful. We did the big art monograph, Mythology, which Chip Kidd designed. And we've always stayed in touch and, always been friends. So when I came to Abrams, it was always a dream to have Alex on the list and trying to figure out what that was and what the right project would be. And we had a couple of things that we had developed, and we just, as we were going over it, just didn't ultimately feel right. So we put it on the back burner. And then he was working on this Fantastic Four book. Marvel was going to do it, but it wasn't in a format that they publish. If you remember the old graphic novels back in the 80s, Jim Starlin's Captain Marvel was 8.5 by 11. And that was something that Alex, like the tabloids, was a format that he wanted from his childhood, that he wanted to kind of be a part of. It was the same thing. He liked those graphic novels, like the Captain Marvel by Jim Starlin. So it wasn't a format that they could do. So he proposed to Marvel, well, you have a relationship with Abrams. Why not see if Abrams would want to publish it? And Marvel said yes. It was a really, I won't say easy conversation, but it seemed to make a lot of sense. And it was one of those things where Marvel saw the positive possibilities for it. So I think what Alex has been and I've been talking about in this imprint is primarily writer-artists, although, like you mentioned, the Michael Cho one, that's being written by Chip Kidd. So there will be a couple of teams that we have in the works, but I think what we're trying to do is focus on single characters or team-ups, but making it so that each book is standalone. It's everybody's first graphic novel. So, for the Fantastic Four book, if you've never read a Fantastic Four book, hopefully if you read that book, because we have a little origin on the front, everything you need to know to understand who the Fantastic Four are and what that story is about is in there. And the same thing for Patrick's book. Patrick has a very different style that he does in Mutts. And the initial idea was that it was going to be done in that style. That was where I, when I approached him about doing something in the Mutt style, because if you ever see the sort of Marvel riffs that he does on his in his strip, it's very different than what Superhero's Journey is. But he came to the realization that if he does it in that, and as you know from our release on that, it integrates pages of classic Marvel comics by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Don Hecht and Steve Ditko. He felt that if he did it in his style, he's just going to suffer by comparison. So he stepped backward a little further and he said, I want to sort of do this in the style that I did when I was first growing up and reading comics. So there's more childlike feel to it on purpose. There are pages that show you what he's capable of, but it's intentionally meant to sort of evoke the wonder of a child and, create that experience that he had as a kid discovering comics, Marvel comics in particular, and these superheroes. So each book is going to be different visually. I think each book, what I liked about Alex's book was it wasn't his regular painterly style. He wanted to try something completely different. I feel like one of the things that I pride myself on doing is, we're very artist friendly, author friendly. My job is not to tell somebody to do this particular book. It's to help them tell the book that they want to tell in the best way possible. And that's what we've been able to do. All the editors that work on ComicArts, we sort of, work with our authors and artists to make sure that we're telling their story, not the story that we would do. And that is certainly something that does happen at some companies. The editor-in-chiefs have a very clear point of view, and they sort of bend the artist to their will, so they're telling those kind of stories. You see that in the tenure of certain people at certain big companies, that if you're a comics reader, they all sort of have a same feeling to it because they reflect the sensibility of the person at the top. I didn't want that. I never, I trust my instincts, but I also trust, the instincts of the creators, the individual creators, to tell stories, and, how do I guide them in telling them better?
It would be very strange if the comics and graphic novels arm of an art book publisher was very specifically defining what art should look like. I mean, it fits or at least what I believe to be like the Abrams ethos. And then on top of that, it just, I don't know. I mean, it makes sense. You do work with, even beyond MarvelArts stuff, you do work with a lot of writer artists. And so it's, I don't know, are you really going to tell Durf Backdurf that, you need to draw this in this specific way rather than the way that you're going to draw it? I mean, that's going to be a not fun conversation, I imagine.
No. And, I don't like to get into, those kind of things if I don't think I could make my case or win the argument.
Right.
But what I did, for my friend Dahmer is interesting. If you see the self-published comic that he did, the 22-page comic that Dahmer sprang from, by the time I got my friend Dahmer, and it landed on my desk, he illustrated the entire book. It was written and illustrated and lettered. And it was really powerful. And it wasn't something that I thought I was going to publish. It wasn't something that I particularly liked his art style from the comic strip The City, but it matched the subject matter of what he's doing. Now I think he's one of my favorite artists, and one of my favorite creators. But I also think that if you look at Kent State, he's come into a whole nother level of being an artist that you couldn't even see from the comic strip The City, or even from my friend Dahmer. But what I did ask him to do on Dahmer was to add a gray wash to it, because it was line art and everything was flat. And I had a couple of examples I sent him of stuff that had some tonality to it that added some dimension. So he ended up doing that, for the book, which wasn't part of the original plan and whatever. So, I think, again, if you're going to make suggestions to somebody, it's got to be something that's going to make sense to them. If I said to Alex, I want to do Fantastic Four full circle, but you got to do it fully painted, it wouldn't have happened, because his vision for that story was very much rooted in that visual sort of aesthetic that was part of, Kirby's later work, the black light posters, that we just put out, as these big black light portfolios. There were lots of reasons for him to do that art style, and it was something that made sense for the Fantastic Four for him. So there was no, as much as, I was really excited to have would have been really excited to have something painted by him, because that's what fans want. I was more excited that Alex was willing to try something different, and happily surprised that fans went along with him. There was nobody who said like, oh, I'm disappointed in this book because it doesn't look like what he did. If anything, they'll be disappointed because his next book will be more a return to what he did before. This was, it'll still, be beautiful and all that stuff, but it will, the story dictates, the visual style.
Yeah, I think that's a commonality amongst most of the stuff I've read from Abrams ComicArts. A good example of that is, it's not as significant, maybe, or maybe it is equally obvious, but it's as Alex's change in art. But I really love the Night Eaters, the She Eats the Night, the first volume, and Sana Takeda's art in there is not exactly the same as Monstrous. And I think that if it was published somewhere else, maybe they would have been like, "Why aren't you doing the Monstrous thing?" And I could see why that they would say that, because Monstrous is a very successful book, but at the same time, what Sana did in that book made sense for the book. And you have to reflect the story you're trying to tell with the art.
Yeah. And I think that was part of the connection between Sana and Marjorie and Charlotte Greenbaum, who was the editor of that book. I didn't edit that book or acquire that book, but I think that partly the reason Abrams got that book was because Charlotte and Marjorie and Sana hit it off and shared a vision for it in terms of like, yeah, this book should be what it is what it needs to be, and it doesn't have to be monstrous. I think, there's when something's successful, everybody wants to repeat it. That's true of Wimpy Kid, or true of, success like Monstrous. Scott McCloud called it the race to be first, to be second. If something's successful, how do we copy that? And I think that, we want to build off of Monstrous, of course, but we also want to encourage Sana to do what she does best, which is create art that reflects the story she and Marjorie are telling. I think that's one of the strengths of that book.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not casting aspersions because this is when I grew up reading comics, but you were at DC, you started at DC in like the 90s, right? And like the 90s was the time where it's like everybody's got to be Jim Lee or everyone's got to be this. And it is interesting to think about how different artistic approaches on, single issue comics are versus graphic novels. And maybe it's a nature of the audience, maybe it's the nature of the publishers. I don't know what it is, but it is kind of interesting. But I did want to ask about, there was something I noted in recent years is Abrams had a bit of a surge in recent years of big names who are perhaps like traditionally direct market oriented on the comic side, with people like, Sana, I mentioned, Marjorie Liu, Brian Michael Bendis, all of them published titles at Abrams ComicArts. I'm curious as to like, what was the origin of that? Was that just like synchronicity of some great talents expanding their horizons and doing so at Abrams? Or was it more of a deliberate effort by you and your team to bring in folks like that?
I think it's a combination of that. I think that, I'll go back, Kyle Baker is a big name. He was, one of the first books that, original graphic novels that I published here, and then there's somebody like Brian Fees who, I like working with people at the start of their career. But I think that people like Brian Michael Bendis and Marjorie Liu, in particular, and Alex Ross, obviously, were paying attention to what we were doing. And I think, success obviously breeds success. So that's good. And I think that, we want to publish original graphic novels and give people their start. We want to work with people like Durf Backdurf or Bill Griffith, who are late in their careers doing original graphic novels for the first time. Bill Griffiths had an amazing career doing Zippy the Pinhead, and all of a sudden, 6 or 7 years ago, decides to do his first graphic novel with Invisible Ink for Fantagraphics, and then Nobody's Fool for Us, and now Three Rocks, and it's like, that's a good second act. But, working with people like that, I think that they paid attention. Word travels, obviously. So, the reason I got to publish Noah Van Sciver was because, he was friends with Durf. Durf and I were down in Miami at the book festival. Noah was hanging out with us. And, at one point, Durf said, "Oh, you should mention to him about your Mormon idea that you had." And, the minute he said Mormon idea, I was like, "What?" So, I think it's all additive. It's like, Kyle leads to so-and-so, or, Art Spiegelman leads to, Bill Griffith, Durf leads to Noah Van Sciver, and then, we did certain, like the art book, like Dan Klaus book, working with Dan, has led to a couple other monographs that we haven't announced yet that are in the works. So I think it's just additive, and it's word of mouth. But from from a company point of view, certainly want to attract big names, and with big names comes, hopefully, an idea that sounds really exciting, or it's a project that they decided wouldn't be right at a mainstream publisher, or, don't forget, like, the big comics publishers, Marvel, DC, obviously they own their own characters, as well they should. And, when we're doing books at Abrams, as opposed to some of the other houses, we don't keep movie rights. We don't keep copyright on that. That's all belongs to the artist. We're not owned by a parent company who has a movie studio, or with any of those sort of other encumbrances. So I think there's a way that, we can be appealing to other creators to want to be part of what we do. And I'm excited that you mentioned them, because I do think that with the MarvelArts, building from, having, Marjorie and Sana and Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Ross, that's leading to other people coming to the MarvelArts line, which again, I'm excited to announce at some point, not to be coy, but, we have some big names, being part of that, which is really exciting. So, hopefully that'll lead to other creators coming out of the woodwork, or saying like, "Hey, I noticed that you published this. What about this?"
I'll be honest, the one I really want to know is who's doing The Road, just because that is an imposing project to take on. I mean, I love The Road. It's an incredible book, but at the same time, boy, that is a pit of misery.
I'm really excited about that. And I got to say that sort of, segues where I was going to, mention, like, I've talked a lot about, comic arts, up until now, but, Rudolph Lachey, who's our new publisher of Comic Arts, who I'll be working with, has this vision for where Comic Arts could go, expanding it to include some, novels that are published in France and overseas, as well as manga. And The Road was one that our French parent company, Media Participations, had in the works, and felt that it was, right for Abrams. I would like to think that we would have published that book, no matter if we weren't going to do this new division of Comic Arts. We would have, if that came across as an option, we would have leaped at that for sure. I'm not sure the creative team. I don't think we've announced that yet, but I will say that the art is done and it's spectacular. And we're working on a cover, so I think that'll be announced and revealed shortly. But yeah, it's an amazing book, and I do think Cormac McCarthy apparently has been very involved in every part of the process. So yeah, he approved the artist, he's approved every page of the book and the adaptation, and made comments along the way. So I think it's going to be a really powerful, beautiful book.
One thing I think is interesting, I just got back from an extended vacation in France. I was there for 3 weeks, and I didn't realize that Abrams was owned by a French company, Media Participations. And it's interesting because in a lot of ways, especially after that trip I just took, Abrams kind of feels like a French comic publisher, or more like a French comic publisher than an American one. It's really fascinating. And like, and some of the things are like subtle. It's like, if, let's say Phenomena probably would not have been printed in black and white if it was at like Dark Horse or something like that. Right. Because that's a tough choice from a marketing standpoint. It's a great choice from an artistic standpoint. Or like even the more album size nature of like Fantastic Four Full Circle. Like that is an unconventional size for, comics. It certainly isn't in France though. But it is just kind of interesting because after I found that out, it was like everything kind of crystallized, and I was like, whoa, this actually makes a lot of sense. Abrams ComicArts has got this like French vibe in my mind now.
Well, it's funny that you said that. So I think that, before Media Participations, we were owned by another French parent company, EDLM, Editions de la Martiniere. So I think when Abrams was sold in the I think in the late 90s, we were purchased by, these French parent companies. And I think they were interested in the fact that we were an art book publisher. Perhaps, we were the first and most venerable art book publisher. And I think, that gives a lot of credibility. But also, I mean, who doesn't love going to France and, being in Paris and sort of looking at all the artwork? And I think it's a lot of the books that EDLM was publishing, made it onto the Abrams list in the early 2000s, and when I first got here, and that sort of got us going. And then when Media Participations came, there were talks about what kind of books we could do that they're publishing, and what kind of cross publishing we could do between companies. We do the Simpsons books, the Simpsons Futurama we did, which our French parent company published. We do the new Treehouse of Horror books, which they're doing in France. So there's been some synergy going back and forth. And, I think, talking about Phenomena being black and white, it goes back to what you said earlier about, letting artists have a vision for their work. Andre Arroyo, who is the artist on that, his work was so breathtaking that doing it in black and white really made the most sense, because adding color seemed to take it away. Mm-hmm. There's a real manga feel to that book. We have plans to sort of, we're finishing up the second book now. We'll do the third book, and then we'll sort of collect them, and might do different formats and play with them on different lists, whether it be in a manga format or something like that. But again, you work with somebody like Brian and Andre, and they have a vision for what they want to do. So my job is to help them fulfill that vision in a way that will be commercial, and also to tell the story in a way that, obviously I'm a proxy for the reader as an editor. All editors are. So, want to make sure, that I, as the reader, am sort of on for the whole journey, and sort of settling in for the first book and getting ready for where it goes. So, again, probably not an easy decision for some other comic book companies, but for us, it wasn't a discussion. It was more like, I certainly asked about color, and it was something that they really wanted to do in black and white. And, and that was the end of that. I wasn't, there was no like, are you sure? Or no begging, or it was, all right, that's the vision for the book. So how do we do it now in a way that works best?
And it looks incredible. It really does.
Yeah. But the second book is really cool too.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. May is lining up to be one of the biggest months ever for Zoop. It's going to feature campaign launches for the Stardust anthology spearheaded by Van Jensen, Jason Copeland's powerhouse Full Tilt, Shannon K. Garrity's Skin Horse, Luciano Vecchio's Sereno, and an art book by the one and only Jorge Molina. Not only that, but you still have time to support Mark Nelson's Thunder Hunters and rising superstar Marco Fontanilli. It takes less than 30 seconds to sign up, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, the creators appreciate your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. I did want to bring up, you mentioned there was the whole announcement of how Abrams ComicArts was becoming its own division, and like you mentioned, Rodolphe Lechat is overseen as publisher and vice president. But the interesting thing is like there was all that announcement, which was a big deal. But within that announcement was the fact that you're going to be doing manga as well. And I do think that's a really interesting part, especially coming from, media participation side, where in France, like France is so into manga, and it's like, it almost makes like America's interest in manga seem kind of casual in comparison. I was told recently it's about 40% of their total comic market.
Oh, wow.
Which is pretty incredible. I am curious as to, does publishing manga, does that require any like shift of approach, or is it just a continuation of a direction you've already been headed in?
I think it's both. We've talked about manga over the years, but you can't just do a single manga title, and like anything, you can't just do one comic book, graphic novel or whatever. You either commit to a program or not. And I think with manga, you could do the one-off, but and Phenomena was sort of a way of like, oh, that's having our manga cake and eating it too. You could sort of do both. But what this allows us to do is leverage our relationship in France with all the manga companies. I don't want to speak for Rodolphe, who has not only a vision for this, but a whole plan in place of how we're going to roll these out and what titles will be part of that. And I think that what's really exciting in my conversations with him is that he's thinking very differently than we have. And I think that, like any company, you're not on autopilot, but you do what you do and you do it well, and then you repeat. And we have 2 seasons, fall and spring. So we know how to do those books. We know what we do. But to do something different, even back launching ComicArts was a little bit different because it involved our going to Comic-Cons. It involved us having a relationship with Diamond and other places, and, creators, not just creators, but reporters or podcasters or whatever who specialize in comics. So in other words, if you're going to do something, there's a whole infrastructure in place. Like you wouldn't start a cookbook line if you didn't know what was involved in making a cookbook, or who are the places that sell cookbooks, or who are the people who buy them, or what are the people who buy cookbooks want.
Right.
So with manga, we're working with a team who knows how to do this and knows where the sort of absences are in the market in America. So, obviously, you have companies like Viz who publish spectacular work, and it's hard to compete with that. So what you have to do is create your own identity that's separate from that. I think Rodolphe has a vision for that will allow us to do something that may seem at first like, oh, Abrams is getting into manga now, but it's more like, oh wow, Abrams is getting into manga in a way that makes sense for Abrams.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's a thin line there, right? Where it's in one way it could be just opportunism without thought, and it seems like this one is the other way, which is more like you have this, you have a partner in media participations who's already doing this. You have an opportunity because of that, and the market is kind of primed for it, and there's kind of a gap that you guys have identified. So it's less about opportunism, and I guess it's opportunistic in its own way, but it's more about, does this fit Abrams' vision? Does this fit what you're trying to do? And is there a fit in the market for it? If the answer is yes, you go for it.
Yeah, I think it's less opportunism than evolution. I think that, when you're doing something, you can just keep doing what you're doing, or you could branch out. And that's like, go back to children's books, at Abrams, Abrams was an art book publisher. And then Howard Reeves started to do children's books at Abrams long before I got here. And he started to bring in certain titles like, we published Babar. So we had that license, even though Random House had the classic titles, we were doing newer Babar books. And then he did Hello Kitty. And then he started doing, picture books that were seasonal, or the kinds of books that any publisher of children's books would do. Then developed, middle grade, YA. Eventually we started doing comics. Eventually we started doing, Wimpy Kid. We started doing other comics titles. Everything is sort of like, he could have just said like, all right, I'm just going to do picture books because that's whatever. But
right.
It's sort of one thing leads to another. I think that for lack of a better term, like Comic Arts 2.0 is sort of like the evolution of what we've started. Everything's been sort of seeded. We have the name recognition. We've built the credibility. We have the creators. Now, how do we take that and add to it in a way that will make sense for Abrams first and foremost, but also add to the market something that's been missing? And I think that a lot of the voices of creators in France and in other countries, there are a lot of publishers who publish quote unquote buy-ins from foreign publishers, but how do we do it in a way that makes sense for Abrams? That's ultimately what's gonna drive, the titles that we acquire.
Yeah.
And like I said, Cormac McCarthy being, a good example. I think even if we didn't do this evolution with ComicArts, we would have published an adaptation of The Road, because we had great success with Octavia Butler's Kindred and Dune. So, there are two literary works that we adapted that have done very well for us. So we're certainly looking for more. We have others in the works that we haven't announced yet too, but that was certainly, would have been one that we would have jumped on.
I do think it's interesting to see that evolution through the prism of just kind of visibility. Like, for example, like this is on me, but, when the MarvelArts deal came out, and then also when like Phenomena and like the Night Eaters were announced, those were more kind of, kibble for the direct market oriented folks like myself. I mean, I'm not strictly direct market oriented, but at the same time, that's going to have big waves in like the comic sites and the comic podcasters and all the things you're talking about there. And it is interesting where the perception, like the visibility of Abrams ComicArts changes, because it's not necessarily that you're bigger than you were yesterday. It's just you're bigger in a certain segment than you were yesterday. And like, that's part of the evolution, I imagine, is, continuing to expand and continuing to find different places where you can have a presence in.
Yeah. And I think that comes from the contribution of different voices. And by that, I mean, I'm one editor who works on these titles. Rudolph is the newest publisher. Before him was Andrew Smith, who is, my publisher for the last 6 years. And I think part of what Andrew is pushing us to do is to be more commercial, to find things that were going to have some legs, to build programs, whether it be the MarvelArts line or, series and things like that. And, when I look back at the beginning of ComicArts, some of the biggest titles that we've had were books that were brought in by other people who worked for me, granted, but were people that I supported. So, for instance, I mentioned the Octavia Butler books, Kindred, and that was signed up by an editor, Sheila Keenan, who worked for Abrams, worked for, a senior editor working for me. Sadly, to my lack of knowledge, I didn't know who Octavia Butler was, and I hadn't read Kindred until she had mentioned it. But she was very excited about the project, put together the team with Damien Duffy and John Jennings. And I'm not the kind of publisher or editor who would be like, well, I never read it, so therefore it doesn't matter. It was like, she was very passionate about it. She had already thought about it, put through the team. I had the contact with the agent who represents the estate, so I put her in touch. But that book wouldn't have happened if it was just me making decisions by myself. Another book we did was The Best We Could Do, which was by T. Bowie. And there I had an editorial assistant, Clarissa Wong, who, encountered, T's work, shared it with me. I gave her some feedback on the story and the artistic sort of approach for it. And then, she developed that. And then, that became a big hit. I think that everybody's contributing, and that, again, it's part of the evolution where, before Andrew, there was another publisher, Susan Van Meter, before that, Steve Tager, before that, Eric Kimmel, who was there, so like all these people have been guiding me and also, sort of challenging me and pushing me and questioning me. And that's a good thing. And, now Rudolph coming in, looking at what we're doing and saying, hey, did you ever think about doing that? It's like, frankly, I hadn't, but I'm open to it because, having been at Abrams for 18 years, somebody comes along and says, hey, how do you like the idea of us expanding the footprint of comics and giving it more resources? I'm all for that. That's very exciting to me because, we could keep going and doing what we're doing, but the opportunity to do something new and different and succeed wildly, which I think we will, is really exciting. It's very easy to coast. You mentioned, we were talking about Wimpy Kid before. People in my shoes, I could very easily just edit Wimpy Kid and, the company would be very happy, as long as that book got done and was, I could do 1 or 2 titles after that. But it was an opportunity while working on Wimpy Kid to do more comics. And now the more comics has led to an opportunity to do more comics in a different way and different comics than we would have.
Yeah.
So, it seems like a good time.
I just have a couple more questions. And one, I do think it's interesting to kind of like look at all this from the prism, again, of where Abrams ComicArts started. Because, like, again, 2009 was a completely different world, especially through the prism of the past couple of years where, 2021, 2022, particularly 2021 was just like insane for sales, and the market was just exploding. And, the book market has went from like this part of, it was like the smaller part of the overall comic industry, and now it's the big part of it. And it's interesting to see that, evolution from, I imagine it was especially interesting to see it from the inside, but I'm curious as to, we're in 2023 now, coming off 2 giant years. Some people I've talked to said 2023 has started a little weird, but, manageably weird. I'm curious as to how you view the landscape right now. Like, are you feeling good? Like, both overall and in terms of Abrams ComicArts' position and all of it?
Yeah, when ComicArts started in 2009, and certainly when I came to Abrams in 2005, comics weren't what they are now. And again, it's sort of like, all right, so at the beginning of that whole venture, it was, everybody pointed to Mouse, so they pointed to Persepolis, and then Fun Home came along, and then to me, in between some of those titles was Stuck Rubber Baby by, Cruz, which I think is a remarkable work. So there became these benchmarks, but then you started to get, like Publishing Mom's Cancer and other books. I'm getting proposals from agents who never published comics before, didn't really know what they were, but comics are sort of like, oh, that's trending. So, let me publish a comic, send you a graphic novel. And I think part of the biggest challenge I had back then was to be discerning, because, every cover letter said, just like Persepolis and Mouse and whatever. It's like, well, every book is not going to win the Pulitzer Prize. Every book is not the first. So those weren't good comps. I had to look at it and say, like, what makes sense for Abrams? And one of the evolutions that has happened with us was I mainly published nonfiction graphic novels, more or less, because that was an easier hook. And I stayed away from superheroes because we weren't going to create our own superheroes. So we found a way to do that eventually with MarvelArts, but we weren't going to do fiction because it was harder to do unless you had a huge name attached. Doing fiction is challenging because how do you break it out of the noise of everything else that's published? So what we were able to do in sort of publishing nonfiction was create an identity that, we were the ones who did Climate Change or The Age of Selfishness by Darrell Cunningham, or titles that sort of in nonfiction form, like Jeffrey Dahmer, were easy for somebody to wrap their brain around. So you may not know who the creators are, but you know who Jeffrey Dahmer is. You may not know who the author of the Climate Change book is, but the subject matter is something that you'll know. Megascope, which was an offshoot, an extension of what we did with John Jennings working on Kindred, was developing an imprint that allowed us to showcase different voices and different creators, and also tell different kinds of stories, but also tell fiction, which was really exciting. So, Megascope is continuing to be part of what we do at Abrams, at ComicArts. And, I think that what you're looking at now in the landscape is there's a greater acceptance of comics. There's a better understanding of what makes a good comic. There are, I'm sure you could rattle off the names of a bunch of comic book publishers or mainstream publishers who had comics imprints that no longer do, because they were publishing whatever the agent sent them instead of having, like, sort of being discerning and trying to find the thing that could break out beyond the the usual license stuff or the big names. I think where we're at now is that the comic publishers have settled a little bit. We know who the landscape is. You could tell what a ComicArts book is, but from a Fantagraphics book, from a Norton book, from a First Second, from an IDW book, it's it's very clear, I hope. And the good thing also on that is, when we were working on when we were launching ComicArts as an imprint, somebody had asked me who the competition was. And I wasn't being coy, but I said that, there is no competition. Not that, nobody can compete with us, but everybody does something different. And all those publishers of all those imprints are friends. So, I'm not in competition with Mark Siegel. I want him to succeed like he wants me to succeed, First Second, because, rising tide lifts all boats. So if First Second has a hit, we as a company at Abrams can point to it and say, like, oh, that's the kind of stuff that, is selling, or look, that can break out. How did they do it? So I think the landscape has settled a little bit and shifted too, in that, you're seeing changes at the mainstream publishers like DC and Marvel in what they do. and what they're no longer publishing, and the opportunities that something like MarvelArts allows a mainstream publisher to do. So I think the market's easier. During the pandemic, obviously it was rough, but it was good for some publishers because people were home reading, and that helped a lot. So it was really scary at the outset because people weren't going into bookstores and Amazon wasn't prioritizing books as essential objects, but it sorted itself out. And then I think the industry as a whole, certainly as a category for comics, is rising according to everything that I've seen in in ICV2, and the beat is pointing toward a trend, trending up. So, I'm happy to be sort of in a medium that's trending up as opposed to, something that's been stable or trending down.
I do like your approach, though, because it kind of reminds me of what we were talking about with artists finding the right style for the story rather than just chasing like a kind of this is what it's supposed to look like sort of thing, where I do think that there can be a tendency amongst some in the publishing world to be like, what's the trend? So let's do that. Like, let's slap this comic up on Webtoon because kids love Webtoon,
right,
even if it doesn't make any sense. And it is kind of interesting, though, because, I mean, what was the number one, probably most well-reviewed comic last year? It was Kate Beaton's Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands. Nonfiction. And it's an autobio book. And like, that's kind of your wheelhouse. That's kind of the realm. And it's interesting because a lot of people have always talked about Raina Telgemeier is huge. Dave Pilkey's huge. They have all these young reader books. Manga is kind of like this teenager realm. Like what's for adults? And it's interesting where I kind of feel like by just being yourself, you're kind of existing in this world that is the answer to that in some ways. And I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe the big takeaway from this is from a publishing standpoint, it's like stick to your guns and, come up with your identity and be you. And it's a pretty good path to take.
I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. I think that, that's really all I could do ultimately is publish the kind of books that interest me, and that's what I've always been able to do. Brian Fees often says, because he would tease me about that. It's like, oh, somebody would ask, like, what's a comic arts book? He's like, it's a book that Charlie likes. That was true for a period of time. But then, when people like Charlotte came on board and Andrew and now Rodolphe, that, that all evolved. And again, it's, I think part of being successful, I hope, is to be smart enough to know what you don't know. And,
yes.
And admit that and not fake it and not, sort of double down on your ignorance, but, sort of embrace the fact that there are lots of other voices that can contribute and you can't know everything. Full disclosure, I'm not a big manga reader. It doesn't mean I'm not a fan. It doesn't mean I don't appreciate it. I published the book on The Art of Suzuka. I'm a huge fan of his, but I appreciate when somebody knows something that I don't, because that's, as a publisher at Abrams, it's sort of, I got the white male Brooklyn Jewish thing covered. I'm looking for other points of view from, that are different than mine. And, that means everybody that we've hired has always been different for a reason, because, that's how you find things like, The Best We Could Do or Kindred and all the books that John Jennings is curating for us on Megascope. There's no one human being who has that kind of varied interest who could do all of that. So, what you have to do is surround yourself with people who really share your passion for what you do and also have resources that you don't, in reaching out to other kinds of creators, coming up with other ideas, having a different cultural background that allows them to, sort of publish or write or edit or acquire books that are different than yours.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing a very good job of it, Charles, but that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Abrams ComicArts, MarvelArts, and everything else you're doing. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate having me on.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Abrams ComicArts Editor-in-Chief Charles Kochman. You can find his work in Abrams ComicArts releases. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman, who stepped in to edit this week's podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Darcy Van Polges, Kevin Bides, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Travis Gibb, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Chris Ray, Nir Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submen Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Massell, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hall, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grumbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Chris Rata, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the song's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out both their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.